characters. How many should I have? And when should I introduce them? Do I introduce the right ones? When should I introduce these characters over here? And at what point in the story? Hey everybody, it's James Mansfield. Thanks for joining me here on The Right Stuff, your home for all things on the writing craft. It's good to be back. I haven't been doing videos for a while. I dropped the ball. Life got busy. I'm just making excuses. But anyways, for my return video, I am going to be talking about characters, and my last video, I believe, was developing characters. This video is going to be more on like how many characters should I have, and like I said, when should I introduce them? Do I introduce them all at the same time at the very beginning? Because some people have these wonderful characters in mind and they want to get them to the readers as quickly as possible, and then readers get overloaded. Oh my gosh, that's too many. Or they might have only a couple or three, and they're like, well, you know, I got this one character here, then I got this other character at the midpoint that comes in, and then one final character comes in like 10 pages from the end of the book. We'll talk about that, but those are bad examples. Those are things that you should not do. So please don't do them when you write your novel. Now, just keep in mind again that I'm going to try to present everything as guidelines and not rules, because I don't believe there are rules for writing fiction. There's rules for English and grammar and syntax, but even those can be broken sometimes for the sake of creativity. So, anyways, I'm not going to tell you specifics. I'm not going to say that you should have 10 characters for an epic fantasy and then a cast of 30 supporting characters, and that's just ridiculous. That don't listen to anybody who does that, and I'm not going to tell you that because that's stupid. All right, but I am going to give you some general advice and guidelines on how to do that and what may be the best way to do it. There's good practices for some of these things, and those practices and guidelines are there because they are proven methods that have worked and that readers are proven to enjoy. So that's where I'm going to be coming from. So please don't take anything I tell you as definitive, because I'm going to try not to present it that way regardless. All right, so antagonists and protagonists. I believe I went over this in a previous video, but there's one hero, right, generally, and there is one villain. But when it comes to antagonists and protagonists, you can kind of have multiple of those. You can have characters that are very much in the foreground with your hero and who do everything they can to help your hero accomplish his or her goals. But you can also have multiple antagonists, people who stand in the way of the hero and keep them from doing what they set out to do and accomplishing their goals. And you can actually have characters who fit both of those roles, right? You can have a character who is helping, you can have a character that's helping the protagonist or the hero. You can also have that same character for whatever reason, whether by accident or purposefully actively working against the hero at the same time, who can be defined as both a protagonist and antagonist. But you know, think of multiple protagonists as like Frodo. Frodo is the hero, but he also has Samwise. Samwise is a protagonist, somebody who is helping Frodo get to the end, get to Mount Doom, and destroy the One Ring. Kaladin has Syl, and Batman has Robin. It's kind of same thing with antagonists. You know, Lord Voldemort has I'm probably not going to think of the name right now, but the Death Reaper guys and several of those, Bellatrix, just for an example. All right, so when it comes to numbers on those, just remember that generally it's only one hero. You have one star of the book, and you have one villain, one main person who is actively working against the hero and trying is the main obstacle to the hero. All right. Now, when it comes to the number of antagonists and protagonists that you could have, generally, you don't want too many because, obviously, when you have like an epic fantasy like Lord of the Rings, you have the Fellowship of the Ring, who is this group of people going across and trying to help Frodo. But say in, I don't know, like a romance book, you are generally only going to have one or two characters. Generally two, actually, because it takes, at least two people to have a romantic interest. But you're not going to have like 5 people in that. So just keep that in mind as you're going through. And a lot of this is going to depend on, like I said, genre. It's going to depend on your story and how the story pans out. It's going to depend on your book length. It's going to depend on you as the author and how you want to come about your story. So again, there's a lot of factors to consider. Now, supporting characters, you'll need supporting characters, and these are people or things that aren't necessarily actively helping your protagonist, but they aren't actively working against them either. They're kind of characters that are in the background who might interact with the protagonist or interact with the villain, but what these are is that they're there to provide context and flavor to your story. In the world that you live in the world that you set up and you're building and you're creating, supporting characters are just kind of there to submerge the reader. If you're only focusing on your antagonists and protagonists, your world is going to feel empty. It's going to feel like nobody else exists in your world except for the 2 main ones and then your supporting protagonists and antagonists. So you've got to have these other characters that add to that world, right? And they also really shape the hero's experience as they journey through the story. So it's even going to shape kind of their motives. It's going to shape their intentions. It's going to shape their experiences. And so really, when it comes to supporting characters, these are just people who kind of come in contact, but don't really have any stake. Don't have any stake in the story. All right, and then you have, well, I guess let's talk about how many supporting characters. Again, this one is really, really, really going to depend on how you want your story to play out. It's going to depend on you as the author as to how many you think you should have. You definitely don't want to overfill your world, but you don't want to leave it empty, like I said, either. And then background characters. Now, background characters, I've heard it said that you should not name every character in your book, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you name every single person that is ever written on the page, you're going to be like, wait, who's this guy? Who's this lady? Am I supposed to remember this? Like, what's going on? They have names, so surely I'm supposed to remember. You don't want to do that. Naming every single one of your characters can really disorient and frustrate your readers, because it's generally expected that if you're going to have a named character, that they are going to play some level of important role within your story. So you don't want to name every character, but this kind of depends on what's happening in the story, right? So if you have a character who is calling out to another character, and, well, this character has to say the name of that character because otherwise it's going to be weird if they know each other and they're just like, hey, you. No, they have to be like, hey, John. Like, it makes sense within the context. All right, context matters. Context makes sense. I have a part in my second Ivory Chronicles book where two guards are standing at the city gate, and they appear once, but they both call each other by their names because it makes sense. They're talking to each other kind of while they're talking with one of the protagonists. And they can't really say, hey, guard, or hey, you over there, because they're in the guard. They know each other. They work with each other. So just try to keep that in mind. Again, these guards never come back. They never interact with the protagonist again, but they have names because it makes sense within the world. But when you overdo it, clearly it can distract the reader. So you don't want to have so many that you're just going to make the reader just give up, close the book, and call it done. So when to introduce? Now, well, let me go back real quick. As far as how many of background characters, this is completely subjective. Again, you want to make your world feel like it's alive, but within the context of your story. You don't want so many background characters that the reader gets lost, even when they're not named. If you're coming across multiple characters and you describe each and every one of the people in the street that your hero's passing by, it's going to get overwhelming and it's going to distract and it's going to slow down the pace of your story far too much. So when to introduce? This is kind of a big question because when you introduce too many characters at once, this does the same thing that naming a whole bunch of characters will do. It is going to distract your readers and it's going to keep them from being interested because it's almost like it's the same thing as driving a whole bunch of exposition into a short part of your story. So much so that the reader is going to get lost. At the same time, you don't want to follow one single character for 5 chapters as they wander through the woods or wander down a completely empty ghost town. Sure, it can be done, but if it's not done the right way, it's going to be extremely boring. So it's a good idea to space your characters out and when you introduce them. Sorry, chocolate peppermint tea. It's amazing. You don't want to introduce so many characters at one time or even at the beginning because that's not really interesting. I'm going to hit this forever. But you also don't want to not introduce any characters for chapters on end. Just ask yourself when it makes sense to introduce them. When does a scenario warrant introducing a new character? And is this character going to be relevant enough that you can have a chapter or 2 or 3 interaction with them so that they're important enough that they're worth introducing in the first place. So when is a good time, or when is a good cutoff point to introduce characters in your novel? Well, again, this is going to be completely subjective. It's going to be kind of hard to nail down, but again, like when you're writing, you're going to have to pay attention and get a sense of when it makes sense to quit. Generally, I would say that about the halfway point is a good time to cut off introducing new important characters. Background characters are always going to be there and they're always going to be introduced. Supporting characters can sometimes be introduced way later. It just depends. But when it comes to antagonist and protagonist, I would say halfway is definitely good. Especially when it comes to a series, right, or a trilogy. You can have characters show up in book 2 and book 3 even, because if you have that long of a story, you're going to have characters who come in to contact with these other characters at a later state, and that's kind of a whole different dynamic. But I would say no later than 3/4 of the way through. When you have somebody coming in at the tail end of the book or into Act 3 of the book, that's really too late. It's going to be pretty confusing to the readers if you have this new person come up and say, hey, let me join your team and I will help you throw the ring into Mount Doom. And it's like, no, that doesn't quite work. So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind that it's going to work best when it makes sense. So just let me give you an example. For instance, romance novels need two people from the beginning to build a relationship arc and then, have that romantic encounter. However, if you're doing a romance novel where the protagonist met the love interest, and that's kind of divulged through backtelling, but communication happens through letters, let's say, and let's say this person is going through life and dealing with this romance through letters or whatnot, and then they finally meet in person at the final act of the story. Technically, you're introducing them like way later, but at the same time, like they were introduced way early because you know who this character is, even though you're not seeing them. So just keep in mind that aspects of your story is really going to determine how many characters you have, as well as when you should introduce them, genre, length, setting, etc. And develop those characters who will be around in the future, but less so if they're just kind of a one-off encounter. You can have that, but they're not worth developing. If you have a character who is there for the long haul, then obviously you want to give them a little bit of a spotlight. You want to make sure that your audience knows who they are and kind of where they're coming from, without giving as much detail or story elements as the hero. Also, don't overbear your stories, but don't make them empty. Don't throw in a ton of characters, but don't make them seem like nobody else exists besides the hero and villain and maybe a handful of antagonists and protagonists. So that way it adds to the world building, and that's another topic for another video, I suppose. But world building involves a lot of this kind of character inclusion and how many you should have and when you should introduce them. All right, everybody. So that's it for today. Thank you again, and I hope that wasn't too rough. That was I'm trying to do this with just an outline instead of a script, so hopefully it didn't come off too bad. I will work on it, and I will do my best to make it better in the future. Thank you for being here and on the right. Thank you for being here on the right stuff. And until next time, keep writing.